This is a slideshow about Beowulf and its connection to epic poetry. A quick definition of what is an epic poem. It's a long narrated poem in a specific meter. And the three famous epics from classical literature, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, are all in a very particular meter, but other epics can be in different meters. It has a serious theme, there's violent action, and it typically begins, quote, in medias res, in the middle of things. So that's the very short definition of what is an epic poem. Epic conventions. Sometimes there's formulaic verse. Poets have certain rhythms in their head and certain phrases they can fit to those rhythms. We can think of there's some sentences and phrases that are repeated in Beowulf with slight variations. That was one good king. And I should note, as you take notes, you shouldn't be writing down every word in this little paragraph. Just note that one of the conventions of the epic is formulaic verse, and then have a quick little definition in your own words. That'll be better. An impersonal voice. The voice of the speaker is usually not a character, and it's authoritative. It's not subjective, it's not personal. The speaker can often claim to be inspired by the muses, and I have these examples from classical literature here. At the end of each of these conventions, there's a little question about Beowulf. These are all repeated in the reading questions for Friday, so don't worry about writing down this last question in bold. Famous beginning of the Aeneid, I sing of arms and the man, and then later we get the invocation to the muse. We're not going to see an invocation to the muse in Beowulf, but think about, is there a claim to be kind of inspired by a higher power? In lots of epic poems, there's a long list at some point there's going to be a long list of like ships or weapons or something. Think about, are there any of these lists that we see in Beowulf? The fancy word for this is the catalog, an epic catalog. There is also epic machinery. You might think of the phrase Deus ex machina, where like the god in the machine who comes in and resolves issues. Are there gods or divine, or semi-divine, supernatural in some way characters that are interested in the events of the humans? Do they take an active role in the plot of the story? Epic poems are long. They're very long. Beowulf is pretty long as well, though not as long as the Aeneid, the Iliad, or the Odyssey. And we can kind of tell because there's only one manuscript, that there were some omissions. So it was probably even longer earlier. The protagonist is an orphan wanderer or a lone warrior, some kind of solitary hero who can either, his parentage could be unknown, or he could be the son of a god or a goddess. Aeneas' mother is a goddess, but his father is mortal, who always leaves home for a big adventure, which is usually a war, and he often gets lost trying to find his way home. Along the way, he faces a series of trials that test his character. One of these trials usually involves a trip to the underworld. You are very familiar with this idea of, this is also the idea of like the hero's journey, or the hero with 1,000 faces that comes to us from Joseph Campbell. Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, right? A hero whose parentage is unknown, and perhaps we might think of in the same way that Achilles' mother is a goddess, right? Luke's father turns out to be Darth Vader. He leaves Tatooine for a big adventure fighting the Empire, and along the way he faces a series of trials that tests his character, right? Simba in The Lion King, Um, there's so many stories that follow this motif, and you like epic stories in particular. Well, so think about, should we see Beowulf as this kind of classic hero, like the hero from the hero's journey? Communal ethos. The epic hero always puts the needs of the community over and above his own personal desires. And I want you to think about how do we see that? Where do we see that in Beowulf? Some things to look for as you start reading: cycles of violence. We talked very briefly about about Old English society and how there were these raids and invasions and kind of repeated warfare, cycles of violence. The generosity versus being kind of stingy. Deep concern about somebody's their lineage, like their family history, and kinship. Who are you related to? How are you connected to these people? The fancy word is mutability, but mutability means the transitory nature of life and worldly things. Light versus dark, connected versus isolated, youth versus age, and what are the qualities of a good leader? For Friday, we'll read the first part of the poem that is marked out in your binder. In addition to the previous questions, you should be ready to discuss what kind of a king is Hrothgar, and look at how he is described and his actions. Is Beowulf, think about, is Beowulf too prideful? Do we see, we talked also in Old English literature about the kind of overlapping nature of pagan, Celtic, Druidical culture and Christian culture. Do we see these things, both of these things, coming up in Beowulf? Or, how would we kind of see the culture that is described in this text? And what are Grendel and Grendel's mother's main attributes as characters in this poem? Do you have any sympathy for them? And think about why or why not. Okay, that is a very quick overview of how Beowulf would fit in to the epic tradition.